Hi, I'm Alan Bestwick. Welcome to NASCAR's 50th anniversary, how it all began. For the next couple of hours, Speedvision will take a look back at some of the highlights and milestones of the past 5 decades of stock car racing, events that have formed the backbone of NASCAR's heritage, shaped its growth, and given us so many uniquely American racing heroes. To fully appreciate how successful stock car racing has become today, it helps to remember what racing was like 50 years ago. Following the Second World War, all forms of American motorsport were vying to reestablish themselves. America's love affair with the automobile had resumed, and fans were pretty hungry for racing. In the South, a half a dozen groups were organizing races for American-built cars. These events were very popular, but with so many different groups running races, the sport was fragmented and confusing for spectators and sports writers to follow. One man recognized the need to create a single national championship series that would unite the sport under one umbrella, making it more understandable for the public, more promotable, and therefore more profitable. Jim Foster was one of the right-hand men to NASCAR founder Bill France. Jim enjoyed a lengthy career in the sport, including many years as NASCAR's vice president of marketing. He tells us how Big Bill France became the driving force that changed the face of American racing.
50 years ago, on this date, on this very spot, history was made. I'm Jim Foster. For the last 35 years, I've held various jobs with NASCAR and International Speedway Corporation. But on that date, on December the 14th, 1947, I was in college in North Carolina and doing part-time work as a sports writer. Naturally, dirt track racing in the Carolinas was my beat. I knew a man named Bill France. I'd heard of him. He was a race driver. He was a promoter. But I didn't know that he was such a visionary. It was a rough and tumble sport after the war. There were no rules. Stock car racing was in chaos. Bill got the idea of getting all the promoters, some of the drivers, some of the sports writers together for ideas on how to make it better. Bill was the leader. They noticed that immediately, and they elected him the director in the meeting they had at the Streamline Hotel directly behind me. Prior to being a hotel, it was a military hospital during the war, and since then, it has become a hostel and a very famous spot where NASCAR was born. Bill told the operators that there had to be changes, that they needed to work together, they needed to have rules, they needed to have insurance, they needed to have more prize money. Since he was a driver, he appreciated that. And the meeting lasted 3 days. There was a lot of discussion about what it should be named. Several ideas came up, but finally it came to be the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, because it was the idea that the acronym NASCAR would be easy to say and remember. And today, it is one of the most famous acronyms in the world.
When we return, Jim Foster takes us to the legendary beaches of Daytona for a look at the original sand and asphalt course where stock car racing first captured the hearts and minds of the American public. So stay tuned as Speedvision guides you on a journey through the great races, wheel-to-wheel battles, and spectacular events that have made 50 years of NASCAR an integral part of American sports history. Welcome back. We're just getting started with Speedvision's 50 years of NASCAR, how it all began. It'd certainly be an exaggeration to say that all early stock car racers were moonshiners, but many of the sport's early stars really were veterans of the bootlegging circuit. Not much of a surprise when you consider that many a moonshiner honed his skills by driving flat out through the dangerous back roads of the South. Yet when Bill France gave both moonshiners and the average Joe a high-profile place to race, he selected a site that would help focus national attention on the sport, one far removed from the dark, desolate backwoods and small towns of the South. Today, it's hard to believe that this peaceful beach played host to some of the seminal events in American motorsports history. From From early stock car races to land speed record attempts, Daytona Beach was one of the places to be if you were serious about racing.
I'm standing here at the north turn of the old beach road course. To my left is the track that they ran on in those days, the sand part of the track. They would come up that beach something over 100 miles an hour and make a cut through this turn, which was always very soft, and the tires wanted to rut out and get up in it and slow them down. But when they hit the asphalt just to the other side, they would go down 1.8 miles of asphalt to the south turn and go through a similar type track.
Goldsmith is closing in.
Toward the end of the day, the tide would be coming in. Sometimes they had to cut the races short because of that, but the cars were usually running in the edge of the ocean. But sometimes the drivers would not see the end of the straightaway and would go straight on past the rickety grandstands that the spectators were sitting in and miss the turn and also miss winning the race.
Hey, where is everybody?
My first experience with NASCAR was, I think, in Daytona, February '54, because I went to work for Dynamic in '53 at Indianapolis, which was May, and by the beginning of the next year, we were looking at Daytona, which at that time was being run on the sands. It was Bill France's operation. Bill had established NASCAR not many years earlier. It was a very small organization in a little frame house in downtown Daytona where you'd have to go to get your credentials, your pit passes.
The National Association for Stock Cars has been supervising these famous Daytona Beach trials and races since 1947. These Daytona Beach International Performance and Safety Trials, supervised by NASCAR, are actually outdoor laboratories. NASCAR sanction means that not only the cars, but all accessories, including fuel and oils, are standard products. In one day at Daytona, cars and products go through a tougher test than 3 years average running on the highway. The men who drive these cars are professionals. Their income and their lives depend on the performance of their cars and products.
There was no way at that time to figure that this whole event would get as big as it was, particularly since it was not strong in any of the major media centers. And the stories, of course, you've probably heard a million times, that it started out with just friendly competition between rum runners, between whiskey moonshine runners, which is probably partly true, but probably partly exaggerated.
1949 was the first season of racing for the strictly stock class of cars, and the cars were just that. No speed-improving modifications were permitted. The first race was held in Charlotte, North Carolina on June 19th and was a huge success. More than 10,000 fans attended. Additional races were immediately organized, and the first strictly stock championship was underway. Red Byron won 2 races and the championship over Lee Petty and Bob Flock, and pocketed $5,800 that first season. And so the first chapter in NASCAR's history was written. When we come back, the turn of the decade and stock car racing's growing popularity throughout the 1950s. Welcome back. In the 1950s, most NASCAR racing venues were dirt tracks, some as short as a quarter mile. So imagine how spectacular it was for drivers to suddenly find themselves competing on a 1.25 mile paved track with steeply banked turns. NASCAR's biggest achievement for 1950 was the opening of Darlington Raceway on September 4th. Johnny Mance won the inaugural Southern 500 because he was the only driver to use hard compound truck tires. The high speeds on the paved superspeedway tore up his competitors' regular dirt track tires, and Mance finished 9 laps ahead of runner-up Fireball Roberts. The first 500-mile event was a huge success and marked the beginning of a different style of stock car racing, speedways as opposed to quarter and half-mile dirt tracks. For the next few years, NASCAR increased the number of races to 40-plus per year, traveling as far north as Rochester, New York, and as far west as California. Bill France scored big in 1951 when he convinced the leaders of a gala for the 250th anniversary of the Motor City that a 250-lap race would be the perfect way to show off what the automobile manufacturers had been working so hard on. This began the increased involvement of the manufacturers in stock car racing. NASCAR continued to improve on safety at the tracks and in the cars, but by 1953, safety concerns rose after 2 fatalities occurred within a year. NASCAR urged drivers to install roll bars, check that seats were firmly locked to the cars, and that seat belts were secure. These safety concerns also benefited the automobile manufacturers, as NASCAR became a proving ground for many cars on the market. A new car owner named Carl Kiecaper made his debut in 1955 and immediately made a mark with a distinguished 22 wins out of 40 starts. And that was just the beginning. Kiecaper was instrumental at changing car owners' involvement in NASCAR. Known as a perfectionist and intense competitor, he took his racing seriously. In 1956 alone, his Chryslers won 16 consecutive races, 30 total. Some of the best drivers in NASCAR were on his team: Herb Thomas, Buck Baker, and Speedy Thompson. Kiecaper was the first owner to transport his cars by truck and give his team uniform racing suits. The drivers had curfews and were watched closely, but they got paid a then whopping $40,000 a year, considerably more than most other drivers. He also took dirt samples from tracks to improve the performance of his cars. In fact, Kiecaper's cars were so successful, many thought illegal activity was going on, allegations which remained unfounded. Eventually, the fans came to boo Kiecaper after a win. Such was the widespread spectator disappointment with the one-sided winning nature that had taken over NASCAR. Bill France and other car owners were also equally unhappy with how the season turned out. Such bad publicity made Kiecaper fearful of what these negative reactions would do to his Mercury outboard business. So after all of his success, he quit NASCAR, never to be heard from again until he was inducted into the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. Tragedy struck stock car racing in 1957 when an 8-year-old boy was seriously injured along with other spectators at Martinsville, Virginia, after a Mercury driven by Billy Myers catapulted over a retaining wall. The automobile manufacturers strongly recommended that the entire automobile industry pull out of NASCAR and all other racing events. Now, drivers and owners were on their own without any factory support. France took the stand that NASCAR was beneficial in testing cars and vowed to continue to promote safety in supervised off-the-highway areas and would continue to promote safety and performance in stock car racing. NASCAR infancy began on the beaches of Daytona, so it was only fitting that the next evolution in its growth start right there, too. Following 2 years of intense planning and detailed construction, the Daytona International Speedway was opened with the inaugural Daytona 500 on February 22, 1959. The era of the super speedway was born. Many drivers were awestruck at the sheer size and scope of the new speedway. The turns were unlike anything which had preceded it. Richard Petty remembers his first reactions to the track.
First time I came to Daytona was 1959, and at that time you didn't do any testing or anything. You just showed up at the racetrack and run the race. And I can remember coming in the tunnel over in 3 and 4 and pulling out into the infield, and it was the biggest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Darlington was at that time a mile and a quarter track or something. That was the biggest thing we'd ever seen. But there was no buildings on the infield, you know, very few grandstands. It just looked like it just went on and on and on. And I said, man, this is going to be, you know, really something different.
At that inaugural event, Richard's father, Lee, was part of the most exciting photo finish NASCAR had ever seen. In front of a crowd of almost 42,000, Petty and Johnny Beauchamp changed the lead numerous times, never losing sight of one another. On the final lap, Petty and Beauchamp were neck and neck, with Joe Weatherly almost 2 laps behind, right beside them. Petty and Beauchamp crossed in a dead heat at 135.521 miles per hour. Initially, NASCAR gave Beauchamp the victory, but almost 3 days later, Petty was given the official win after careful scrutiny of photographs clearly showed him 3 feet ahead of Beauchamp at the finish. The race was an exciting start to the 1959 season and to a new era in professional racing. The 1950s saw the ascension of NASCAR's first real stars, drivers such as Curtis Turner, Fireball Roberts, Junior Johnson, the Flock brothers, Herb Thomas, Lee Petty, Buck Baker, and Speedy Thompson. But time marches on, and when we return, in come the 1960s and the rise of a new era in NASCAR racing, that of the super speedway. Welcome back. The opening of Daytona International Speedway in 1959 launched NASCAR racing into the 60s in a big way. The 60s were years of tremendous growth for NASCAR as the sport continued to shed its small-time beginnings and develop into a major, well-organized professional sport. The series faced growing pains and learned hard lessons about the fine line between driver safety and the need for ever-increasing speed. And as the decade wore on, a king was crowned. The enormous success of Daytona ushered in NASCAR's Speedway era. With Darlington, Daytona, and the construction of new tracks in Atlanta and Charlotte, the South had its first major league sport. Races became more than events, they became spectacles. The national media started paying attention.
Less than a mile to go now as Lorenzen is behind Davey Pearson, and here's where it could pay off. The checkered flag is coming out. Pearson, can he stay with it? Lorenzen tries to go low. Pearson's going to have to stand on it right now, all the way down, and here comes Lorenzen. They're half a car length apart. Less than 10, and Pearson is in front. Wow, what a finish.
And the people came out in droves to see their heroes. The direction of the sport was becoming evident. People identified with both the drivers and their machines, and that translated into car sales. Since 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association had convinced the big-time automobile companies to distance themselves from stock car racing, saying it promoted foolish speeds and unsafe driving. The manufacturers, publicly at least, complied. But Bill France knew one of the keys to putting on the best show for the fans was to have the latest, most advanced technology on the track, and that meant getting the factories involved.
Bill France came here and begged me at that time to make a deal with Chevrolet for one race. That's what Cole wanted, the Darlington 500. And as luck would have it, we ended up winning the race. And that was the big break that NASCAR got. And then Ford said, well, hell, we're not going to let Chevrolet take this thing away. So then they jumped in, and pretty soon Chrysler come, and then NASCAR finally got a solid cement foundation, and they went from there.
In 1962, Ford officially withdrew from the AMA's policy and basically asked John Holman and Ralph Moody what they needed to win. It wasn't long before the rest of the industry followed suit. With the extensive research and development being poured into the sport, speeds were escalating at an intense rate. At the 1964 Daytona 500, Richard Petty qualified at 174.418 miles per hour, over 19.5 miles per hour faster than his speed just 1 year before.
Well, when you're running at 175 mile an hour like at Daytona Beach, you've got to concentrate entirely on what you're doing. You've got to pay attention every lap. You've got to watch your mirror and watch the traffic, and you've also got to run about a half a lap ahead.
Many drivers were concerned about the escalating speeds. They had recently lost Joe Weatherly, the two-time defending Grand National champion, in an accident at Riverside. It was the first race day fatality in almost 7 years. The Atlanta 500 that year was the scene of several incidents, many including top-name drivers such as David Pearson, Darrell Derringer, Paul Goldsmith, Dan Gurney, Fireball Roberts, and Parnelli Jones. Most of the incidents were the result of blowouts. Tire technology hadn't kept pace with engine technology. Richard Petty was quoted as saying, "I'm afraid someone may die before any safety measures are taken." Later that year, 2 other NASCAR stars lost their lives. First, the popular champion Fireball Roberts after a horrible crash at Charlotte. And then 4 months later, Jimmy Pardue broke through a guardrail while traveling 149 miles per hour, 4 miles per hour faster than the existing track record during a tire test at Charlotte. NASCAR responded by announcing sweeping rule changes for 1965, triggering boycotts and protests from the manufacturers. The give and take between the safety of the cars and rising speeds would be a recurring theme throughout the 60s. France restated the goal of the series to provide fans the same level of entertainment they'd grown used to while not compromising the safety of the drivers. Without question, one driver whose very name is synonymous with NASCAR is the King, Richard Petty. His milestones of 200 career wins and 7 championships are the standards by which all others are measured. In 1967, Richard Petty put together what may be the most incredible season any driver's ever enjoyed, scoring 27 wins. Included in that total, a streak of 10 consecutive victories, including this run at the Southern 500.
All of us are chasing one man and one cause, Richard Petty and his Plymouth. Petty's won more races in one season than any other driver in NASCAR history, 20 so far this year, and more races in his lifetime than anybody. 67 Grand Nationals. Now, whose record did he beat? His daddy's. Where did he break that record? Right here at Darlington in the Rebel 400 last spring. Richard's flying, setting new records as he goes. He's got that car balanced so well he can pass just about anywhere, except on that flat third turn where we run up against the guardrail. Richard's able to run down the front straightaway inches from the wall. It takes a car that's handling perfect and a lot of concentration. Remember, he's made about 1,000 left turns this afternoon, and you get only one mistake at Darlington. Petty's running smooth as grease, clicking off the laps and looking for that white flag. Here he comes into the front stretch. And there's the flag that means 1 lap to go. Petty's still running full throttle, passing them where he finds them. Halfway up the backstretch, he can coast home from here. The Petty crew and everybody along the pit walls holding their breath. Here he comes. Richard Petty wins the Southern 500. Petty won going away. His margin of 5 laps is a Southern 500 record.
The streak ended in Charlotte almost 2 months later as Buddy Baker collected his first NASCAR win. Bill France's guidance of NASCAR faced a couple of delicate tests in the 60s. In 1961, France faced a potential unionization of the drivers in a campaign led by the popular Curtis Turner. France announced he'd sooner bulldoze his own tracks than let the Teamsters into the sport, and backed up that claim by handing Turner a lifetime suspension from NASCAR. Some years later, that suspension was lifted and Turner was allowed to compete again. Later in the decade, as Richard Petty organized the Professional Drivers Association and led a walkout of the inaugural race at Talladega, France again stood his ground, allowed substitute drivers in, and put on a show for the fans. Now the 70s approached, and winds of change began to blow in, bringing with them a serious crisis. That's still to come. Hope you'll stay with us. Welcome back to our look at NASCAR's first 50 years. NASCAR racing reached the 1970s with several issues key to its survival on the table. At the beginning of the decade, the auto factories pulled back their funding for the sport, and many great teams like those of Junior Johnson and Banjo Matthews were looking for help. The time between 1970 and 72 could have been disastrous, but NASCAR survived, and by the end of the decade was actually more popular than ever. What happened? Well, a number of things, all starting in 1970, when Junior Johnson went looking for someone to help pay for his racing. Johnson approached R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company about sponsoring his team for the upcoming season, but the company said they wanted something bigger. A year later, Winston took over as sponsor of the Alabama 500. The spring race at Talladega was now to be known as the Winston 500. R.J. Reynolds also put up money for the season point championship. Winston contributed $100,000 to be distributed among the top drivers throughout the year. The first year of the new Winston Cup was 1971. Richard Petty won his third national championship that year, and his reward was prize money worth more than $350,000. The following year, R.J. Reynolds asked for and received changes to the season schedule. There would now be a maximum of 31 races, and there would no longer be any point-scoring races shorter than 250 miles. The short tracks were phased out, with only Martinsville, Bristol, North Wilkesboro, Richmond, and Nashville remaining within the new Winston point system. The many bull rings that had made up so much of stock car racing's formative history were replaced with the bigger tracks, which enabled Winston to get more exposure for their investment. Likewise, the point system itself also underwent some modification in the early 70s. For 1972, points were awarded according to miles run rather than victories. In 1973, a 25-point bonus was given to race winners. To see if you can follow the 1974 championship formula. Prize money for a given race multiplied by races started, then divided by 1,000. Petty, Cale Yarborough, and David Pearson combined to win 27 of 30 races that year, and even with the crazy system, Petty deservedly won the title over Yarborough. By 1975, NASCAR's current point system was finally implemented. The system is often criticized for rewarding consistency rather than winning, but it has been in place successfully now for 23 years. After 25 years of running NASCAR, Bill France turned over day-to-day operation of the organization to his son Bill Jr. in 1972. But Big Bill stayed on as a consultant, and it was his plan that brought NASCAR through the 1974 energy crisis. That year, the Daytona 500 became the Daytona 450, cutting 50 miles off the traditional race distance. Teams were only permitted to use 30 gallons of fuel for the practice sessions, and the 8 days of practice at Daytona were cut to 5. The Rebel 500 at Darlington and the World 600 at Charlotte were also shortened, as NASCAR did its part to help out during the crisis. The next year, in 1975, national network television coverage expanded as both networks and viewers embraced stock car racing. Television coverage was nothing new to NASCAR, but 1976's Daytona 500 was unprecedented. ABC carried the start live, broke away for the Olympic Games, then came back for the last hour and a half of the race live. Ratings were good for that race in 1976, and the networks began to realize that NASCAR was more than just a regional sport. With network television coverage expanding, corporate sponsorship couldn't be far behind. Richard Petty in 1972 had a car sponsored by STP. It's a relationship that continues today, making this deal one of, if not the longest agreements of its kind. Other teams quickly followed suit, but there were rules. NASCAR was conscious of the television audience, its own family-style entertainment, and its deal with Winston. There were to be no other tobacco sponsors on cars. There would be no hard liquor advertising, and any Winston stickers would be so tiny the television viewers would hardly notice them. By the end of the decade, cars began to look like the moving billboards that have today become the core of NASCAR team's financial base. The 1970s also saw NASCAR introduce several noteworthy technical and safety innovations. Windshield braces were installed in all cars for all races. Window nets became mandatory in 1971, and for the first time in 1970, NASCAR made Chrysler cars run with restrictor plates, which also served to make the racing more competitive. But as with any sport, the goal is winning, and without question the most successful driver of the decade was Richard Petty. In the 1970s, Petty won 71 races and 5 championships. In 1971 alone, he won 21 races with 38 top 5 finishes. He could have won the championship in 1970 if not for this crash at Darlington, which kept him out of 5 races, helping Bobby Isaac to the title. Petty's string was broken in 1973 as Benny Parsons won his first and only Winston Cup title. In the 50-year history of NASCAR, only one man has ever won 3 straight national championships. That man is Cale Yarborough. Cale spent some time in the early 70s running USAC open-wheel cars with moderate success, but returned to NASCAR in 1973, and when he teamed up with Junior Johnson, he became unstoppable in 76, 77, and 78. 1976 marked Junior Johnson's first championship, and And with his title in '78, Yarborough won more than $600,000 in prize money. There were many great drivers in the '70s. We already mentioned a few, but two men who did not win championships still won their fair share of races in the decade. Bobby Allison was as tough as they come. He won 41 races during the '70s, and no one was more competitive than Allison. David Pearson is widely considered one of NASCAR's premier drivers, but you may not realize just how good he was. In his career, he won 105 races and 3 championships. In 1972, Pearson joined the Wood Brothers team, and the partnership was good for 43 wins in only 138 races from '72 to '78. By comparison, Richard Petty also won 43 races in that span, but his came in 202 starts. Pearson won at a rate of 31%. Petty's winning percentage was 21. Pearson's best year was 1973, when he won 11 of 18 starts. And in 1976, David and the Wood Brothers won NASCAR's Triple Crown with victories at the Daytona 500, the World 600, and the Southern 500. By the end of the 1970s, a new era was being ushered in. Darrell Waltrip was coming into his own as a driver. Championships would soon follow. Dale Earnhardt was the 1979 Rookie of the Year. He would lead a class that included Terry Labonte, Harry Gant, and Jeff Bodine. Bill Elliott was starting to show a bit of promise. And by the time the decade was over, NASCAR had a third-generation driver. Kyle Petty began his Winston Cup career. The 1970s ended with what may have been the single most important event in the history of NASCAR, the 1979 Daytona 500, when a NASCAR race was shown live from start to finish on network television without a cutaway to another sporting event in the middle. A huge blizzard had much of the country homebound, and millions saw what was a great race, for many their first exposure to NASCAR racing. The 70s were a difficult time for American racing. A couple of road racing series folded, and CART had split from USAC, dividing the IndyCar scene. But NASCAR came through the decade stronger and more popular than ever. When we come back, the 1980s and a new direction. New cars, new stars, and a couple of milestones for a king named Petty. We're back now to talk about the 1980s. Entering into the early 80s, the shape and faces of NASCAR began to change. The cars became smaller, and the top drivers had new names. As had been the case in previous decades, the 80s brought tremendous growth to the sport, while playing host to some incredible milestones along the way. 1980 ushered in its decade of change, with Dale Earnhardt winning the championship, becoming the first driver to win the title after winning Rookie of the Year honors the previous season. It was also the final year of eligibility for full-sized cars. In 1981, body styles took their lead from Detroit. The cars became lighter, and the wheelbase went from 115 to 110 inches. These new cars initially gave the drivers fits. They weren't as stable and had a tendency to take flight. Darrell Waltrip went on a winning rampage at the end of the season and overcame Bobby Allison's 341-point lead to win the championship. Waltrip captured his second straight title in 1982 by again catching Bobby Allison in the second half of the season. This time he overcame a 147-point deficit in only 4 races. For the second year in a row, Waltrip was the dominant driver, winning 12 times. 1983 saw the first 200-mile-per-hour lap at Daytona when Cale Yarborough went 200.53 miles an hour in his Chevrolet. Richard Petty won his 198th race, but was penalized a record $35,000 for running an oversized engine and illegal tires. He was stripped of the points, but was allowed to keep his victory. 1983 also saw Bobby Allison hold off Darrell Waltrip and finally win his first championship. After 2 lean seasons, Richard Petty left the family business, Petty Enterprises, and switched teams for 1984. On July 4th, he won his historic 200th career victory at the Daytona Firecracker 400 after a terrific duel with Cale Yarborough. In 1985, R.J. Reynolds and Bill Elliott brought unprecedented attention to NASCAR. That's when the tobacco company established the Winston Million, $1 million going to the driver who could win 3 of the big 4 superspeedway races: the Daytona 500, the Winston 500, World 600, and the Southern 500. As unlikely as such a feat might have seemed at the beginning of the year, Bill Elliott made it look easy by winning the Daytona, Winston, and Southern 500s. Elliott dominated all season, winning 11 superspeedway races, breaking David Pearson's record. But even with his dominance, Elliott failed to win the championship as sheer consistency brought Darrell Waltrip his 3rd title. With the close of the decade came another changing of the guard. Cale Yarborough, Benny Parsons, Buddy Baker, Bobby Allison, and David Pearson had stepped down from the throne, and new names became the top guns of NASCAR. Rusty Wallace won the driver's title in 1989, while Davey Allison, Terry Labonte, Alan Kulwicki, and Jeff Bodine joined Bill Elliott and Dale Earnhardt as the new stars of the road. The 1980s showed that NASCAR was a corporate marketer's dream. The popularity of the sport and its increasing visibility had taken it far from its origins. Now it was a frontline promotional vehicle for large corporations, and still there were no limits to its growth in sight. When Speedvision's journey through the first 50 years of NASCAR continues, we'll cruise into the 90s. No longer confined to the sports pages, this new stock market expands into some of the nation's premier business publications. Stay with us. We continue now charting the growth of NASCAR over its first 50 years and come to the 1990s. What started as a regional sport has now become the biggest, most popular racing series in America, with a tremendous sponsorship and marketing base. The cars themselves, well, they're hardly stock anymore. In fact, running a Winston Cup team in the 90s will cost an owner millions of dollars. Offsetting this huge expense, corporate sponsorship, which is flocked to NASCAR, where high visibility and fan loyalty can generate a healthy return on an advertiser's considerable investment. There's an old saying, how do you make a small fortune in racing? Start off with a large one. Well, that's no longer an absolute truth. NASCAR is definitely on the rise. It's the only televised sporting event series to post a ratings gain each year since 1992. The fan base has grown beyond its core southeastern roots, with races now staged in California, New York State, New Hampshire, and even the famed Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Most recently, NASCAR racing has gone global as well, staging an exhibition race in Japan at the end of each of the last 2 seasons. In addition, NASCAR merchandising has become a multi-million-dollar empire in its own right, with everything from cereal boxes to model cars and everything in between, all carrying the sponsors' logos alongside the drivers. NASCAR has become the most sponsor-friendly sport there is today. But what makes these fans so loyal? Why do 100,000 people or more come out every weekend and spend their hard-earned dollars on this spectacle, while millions more watch at home? Quite simply, great racing. NASCAR racing in the 90s has become more competitive than ever before, with some fantastic young stars ascending. While some of the fan favorites of the past say goodbye, and others are taken away too soon. There were moments to remember on the track as well, including the 1992 season-ending race from the Atlanta Motor Speedway, where entering the event, 3 drivers had a shot at the championship. Point leader Davey Allison was eliminated in an early crash, leaving the championship to an on-the-track duel between Bill Elliott and Alan Kulwicki for both the race and the title. Elliott went on to win the race thanks to a better final pit stop, but Kulwicki won the war. By virtue of finishing second, along with extra points given for having led the most laps, Alan Kulwicki won the title by a slim 10-point margin over Elliott, the closest championship finish in NASCAR Winston Cup history. Then there was Sterling Marlin's hard-to-believe back-to-back Daytona 500 victories in 1994 and 95. It was only the third time in history someone had won Daytona twice in a row, a feat made even more remarkable considering that the 94 race was Marlin's first career win.
Sterling Marlin.
There have been numerous milestone moments and many great drivers in the 90s, but the decade can perhaps be best defined in terms of two drivers, Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon. From 1990 to 1994, Dale Earnhardt owned Winston Cup racing. Having been one of the superstars of the 1980s, Earnhardt took it to another level in the first half of the 90s. Starting in 1990, Earnhardt claimed his fourth driver's crown. He followed that up by doing it again in 1991, and in 93, and 94. The 94 championship gave Dale his 7th career title, tying the king, Richard Petty, for most in history. 1995 signaled a changing of the guard for NASCAR as a new golden boy emerged. Jeff Gordon marked himself as a rising star when he won both Winston Cup Rookie of the Year in 1993 and the inaugural Brickyard 400 in 1994. In 1995, Gordon took center stage, clinching the Drivers' Championship by 34 points over a hard-charging Dale Earnhardt, and became the youngest Winston Cup champion in the modern era at age 24. Gordon came back in 1996 to win more races than any other driver and finished second to Hendrick Motorsports stablemate Terry Labonte for the championship. 1997 was another banner year for Gordon. He became only the second driver to win the Winston Million by taking the checkered flag in the Daytona 500, Coca-Cola 600, and Southern 500 races. Gordon went on to win his second driver's title in 3 years and served notice that he intends to be the one to beat for years to come. Gordon's Daytona victory also served notice of the defining trend of the 90s, the rise of the super team. Gordon, along with teammates Terry Labonte and Ricky Craven, used each other to draft past a defenseless Bill Elliott to go 1-2-3 at the Daytona 500.
Whenever Jeff and Terry and Ricky hooked up, I was history. I mean, I knew it. I was a fit duck.
While using a car for drafting purposes is nothing new, this dominant performance suggests that the days of a single car owner may be numbered. Jack Roush is creating a 5-car monster team to help win the Cup and compete with the Hendrick trio. Several more 2-car teams are beginning to surface as well. So how does all this add up for NASCAR into the late 1990s? 2 words: money and racing. The costs will keep increasing both for the teams and fans, but as long as the racing itself continues to be so exciting, there'll be plenty of people to fill the grandstand seats. When we come back, a salute to some of the sport's finest drivers and most colorful personalities. Stay with us. Welcome back to NASCAR's 50th anniversary, how it all began on Speedvision. Stock car racing has produced some of the world's greatest drivers, men whose exploits have left an indelible mark on the sport. Consider this selection of some of NASCAR's legendary figures, men who were not merely winners, but whose personalities and competitive spirit are emblematic of their chosen form of auto racing. Petty, although best known today as the grandfather of the Petty dynasty, was one of the most influential drivers in NASCAR history. Racing in the early 50s, Petty was one of the few drivers untouched by bootlegging. A family man and farmer, Petty started his own team with his own money. His son Richard was a crew member, Lee himself the driver. A fierce competitor, Petty won 54 Grand National events and 3 championships. In 1954, he became the first to surpass the 120-mile-per-hour barrier in Daytona qualifying. In July of 1958, Lee Petty raced for the first time with his son, Richard. His last title came in 1959, driving a Plymouth. Lee Petty ran his last race in 1964. Petty's spirit and integrity helped to establish stock car racing as a family-friendly sport. He remains the first competitor to win at least one race in each of NASCAR's first 7 seasons. Curtis Pops Turner has been dubbed the Babe Ruth of stock car racing. Learning to drive while outrunning federal agents for bootlegging, Turner was wild on and off the track. Throughout the late 50s, Turner could be found running in convertible races and anything the Grand National Circuit could throw at him. In 1957, he had 2 wins at Darlington at the Southern 500 and Rebel 300. Turner took the NASCAR championship title in 1962. However, after a disagreement with NASCAR over unionizing drivers, Turner was banned for life by Bill France Sr. Refusing to leave racing, Turner ran the outlaw tracks and eventually the ARCA series throughout the early 60s. At Riverside in 1964, Curtis Turner lost his closest friend, Joe Weatherly. Devastated over his death, Turner left racing until he was welcomed back by NASCAR in July of 1965. His pursuit of greatness was cut short in October of 1970 by a plane crash. He said he bought the plane because there's no speed limit up there. Racing by his own rules and pushing his competitors to the edge, Curtis Turner's wild competitive spirit propelled NASCAR to a new era of excitement. Fireball Roberts didn't get his nickname from stock car racing. Fireball came from his baseball pitch. However, few would argue that his racing style was any cooler. His career started in 1947, and before his death in 1964, he had won 32 Grand National races. In 1956, Roberts had 5 wins with Ford. The next year, they topped themselves with 7 Grand National victories. He won twice in the Southern 500, the first in 1958 and the second in 1963. Roberts' most coveted victory was the 1962 Daytona 500, where he also captured the 125-mile qualifying race. Fireball Roberts' death at Charlotte forced improvements in safety measures. The fiberglass flame retardant material that drivers found uncomfortable in their uniforms was redesigned. Fireball Roberts was one of the first superstars of stock car racing. His accomplishments can still be found in many places in the record books today. Richard Petty will undoubtedly be remembered as one of the very best stock car drivers of all time. His 7 championships, 200 NASCAR wins, and 7 Daytona 500 victories have already propelled him to legendary status. However, he's known worldwide not only for his racing ability, but for his role as the goodwill ambassador of NASCAR. Richard Petty started racing at the age of 21. Originally hoping to be a good mechanic, Petty wanted to build race cars, not drive them. However, with the help of his father, Petty soon discovered his talent. Entering the Daytona 500 in 1959, Richard was on his way. He destroyed 5 race cars in his first 15 events, but finally found success at the 1960 Daytona 500 with a 3rd-place finish. By 1962, he had won 6 races, and by the following year had 13 victories. His last win was at the Firecracker 400 in Daytona in 1984. The King has earned his nickname. Consumed by a life of racing, Richard Petty helped propel NASCAR into a bona fide national phenomenon. Bobby Allison may have been quiet off the track, but when he raced, he rocked the joint. Bobby Allison had his first NASCAR start at the 1961 Daytona 500. He finished 31st. In 1965, he was back on a shoestring budget, but pulled off 3 victories, finishing 10th in the NASCAR standings. His accomplishment was well noted, and he was picked up by the Ford factory. Over a 27-year span, Bobby Allison won 84 races, including 3 Daytona 500s and 4 Southern 500s. In 1983, he won the NASCAR Winston Cup Championship. To date, Allison says his greatest victory came at the age of 50, beating his son Davey at the Daytona 500. Bobby Allison was forced into retirement after an accident at Pocono in July of 1988. Since that time, his life has been riddled with tragedy. He lost his son Clifford in 1992 after a racing accident at the Michigan Speedway, and then his son Davey in 1993 in a helicopter crash. Cale Yarborough raced for the first time at the age of 18 at Darlington. He started in 44th place and came in 42nd. Prior to his debut on the track, he swept floors and turned wrenches for the Holman Moody team, not only for money, but just to be near the sport he loved all his life. He was known as a thrill seeker, racing at 200 miles per hour just for the fun of it. Before his retirement in 1988, Cale Yarborough won 5 Southern 500s at his home track in Darlington and 4 Daytona 500s. Yarborough acquired 83 total victories, and to this day he remains the only driver to win 3 consecutive NASCAR Winston Cup Championship titles between the years 1976 and 1978. Cale Yarborough's impact can still be seen in NASCAR. The team he owns is 10 seasons strong. John Andretti drove for him in 1997. David Pearson was originally called the Gray Fox until he decided that it should be the Silver Fox because gray made him sound old. His press and fans lovingly obliged. Richard Petty has said that Pearson was one of the best drivers he ever raced against, and to watch them together was to see history in the making. David Pearson has won more poles on super speedways than any other driver in history, including Richard Petty. Proud and confident, between 1960 and 1986, Pearson won at least once on every NASCAR track. He's a 3-time Winston Cup champion with 105 total victories. Pearson is most proud of his wins at Darlington in the Southern 500. He's won at Darlington 10 times. David Pearson's been honored by several organizations, including the International Motorsports Hall of Fame. His natural talent and street-smart driving style made him a champion not only in the eyes of his fans, but also with his competitors.
When we come back, we'll shift our attention to a new breed of stock car drivers, men whose very presence has dramatically influenced racing in its current era. Stay with us. Welcome back to Speedvision's celebration of the first 50 years of NASCAR. Before the break, we paid tribute to some of the legends of early stock car racing, but as they moved on, a confident, intense group of younger drivers began to leave their own marks upon the circuit.
After 25 years on the NASCAR Winston Cup circuit, Darrell Waltrip has 84 career victories, 16 shy of his 100-win goal. Nicknamed Jaws for his outlandish style and vocal opinions, Darrell Waltrip has had a rocky road with NASCAR. Entering the sport in the era of Petty, Pearson, and Allison, to name a few, Waltrip screamed onto the scene, literally. He claimed he could beat the big boys, and he did. Teaming up with Junior Johnson in 1981, Waltrip won 43 races in 6 seasons. He became a 3-time Winston Cup champion in 81, 82, and 85. In 1987, he left Johnson to join Hendrick Motorsports, where by 1989 he had won 79 total races, including the 1989 Daytona 500. Waltrip had gone from villain to hero, winning the Most Popular Driver award in 89 and 90. Racing on his own since 1991, Waltrip has faced changes with his car, crew, and personal life. His outspoken personality has evolved with age, sponsors, and confidence. However, through it all, he's backed his words with actions. Whether he achieves his goal or not, he's proven himself a champion, tackling NASCAR and ending up on the winning team. If popularity won races, Bill Elliott might have been the all-time champion. Voted most popular driver 12 times over 14 seasons, Awesome Bill from Dawsonville has been one of the most beloved drivers on the NASCAR circuit. Calculated and confident, he was the first ever winner of the coveted Winston Million. The year was 1985, and even though he lost the championship to Darrell Waltrip, Elliott proved he was a fierce competitor. Racing under Coors sponsorship, Elliott won 11 races that year, including the Daytona 500. Crediting his success to his family-run organization and the swift work of his pit crew, Elliott won the championship in 1988. He then went on to race with Junior Johnson under Budweiser sponsorship for 3 years. Together, the team achieved 5 wins in 1992. But by 1995, Elliott was picked up by McDonald's and returned to running his own operation. Although wins have been harder to come by in recent years, it's not diminished this driver's remarkable popularity. Aggressive, stubborn, intimidating. This is Dale Earnhardt. His motto, run consistently on all tracks and don't get consumed by numbers. But when you're a 7-time Winston Cup champion, it's easy to get caught up with the numbers. After learning from his father, racing legend Ralph Earnhardt, throughout his childhood, Dale Earnhardt exploded onto the NASCAR scene. Capturing the 1979 Rookie of the Year title, his first Speedway victory and championship came in 1980. Even as his menacing driving style was coming under fire, he kept producing wins. He may never be voted most popular driver, but Dale Earnhardt has managed to tie Richard Petty's championship record and remains a fierce presence on the track. Should anyone ever question the impact of corporate sponsorship on stock car racing, they need look no further than Jeff Gordon. Perhaps no other driver better typifies the marriage of sport and business. Gordon won a Daytona 125-mile qualifying race in 1993. He was 21 at the time, the same age Richard Petty was when he started racing. That same year, he captured Rookie of the Year honors. In 1994, he had his first big Winston Cup wins at the '94 Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte and again at the Brickyard 400 at Indianapolis. And then came the championship in 1995, 7 total wins, 17 top 5 finishes. In 1996, Gordon came in second behind Terry Labonte for the championship after an incredible season, 10 wins and 21 top 5s. But in 1997, his career hit new heights, not only winning a second championship, but also by taking the Winston Million. Through the help of crew chief Ray Evernham, Jeff Gordon has found the keys to success: win the most races, lead the most laps, and take the season by storm. This list is by no means complete, nor is it intended to be definitive. For a comprehensive survey of the legendary wheelmasters of NASCAR, stay tuned to Speedvision in the months ahead. Some of the sport's more spectacular moments have come when arch rivals mix it up. We'll look at some of those great NASCAR rivalries when we continue. Welcome back. Rivalries are one of the things that define and popularize sports. What are rivalries? Well, rivalries are when two people or teams, either through geographic proximity or comparable talent levels at the top of their sport, find their contests against each other to be a little more important than others. Examples: Ali and Frazier, the Yankees and Red Sox, Petty and Pearson. Throughout NASCAR's history, several such rivalries have played a key role in the development of America's fastest-growing sport. Richard Petty and Bobby Allison had a rivalry in the truest sense. Petty was NASCAR's ambassador, a fan favorite who was always readily available to the spectators and the media. Allison was very much his antithesis. Part of the Alabama gang, along with his brother Donnie, Allison developed a reputation as something of a bad boy. With their superb driving skills, these two opposites were constantly in the championship hunt together, resulting in a prolonged friction unique in their day. Bobby Allison had run-ins with other drivers as well. Who could forget the 1979 Daytona 500? Cale Yarborough was forced into a handicapped battle as he took on both Bobby and Donnie on the racetrack's infield. This race turned into a pivotal moment in NASCAR's history as it was the first one shown live from start to finish on CBS television, and millions saw this fight in the infield grass after the race. Alternatively, the King and the Silver Fox, David Pearson, had what you'd call a much friendlier rivalry. These two NASCAR greats proved what they needed to on the track. Off the track, they were amiable and had great respect for one another. In the last race of the 1969 season, these two masters met to decide who would be that year's champion. Petty started 7th on the grid to Pearson's 2nd. The yellow flags kept everyone in suspense, but by lap 110, Petty had the lead, and Pearson was a close 2nd. But Petty pushed his famed 43 into a wall, was forced to pit, and Pearson assumed the lead. Petty's pit crew put in a valiant effort and got the King back on the track, but it was all for naught as the damage was too much to Petty's STP machine and he was out of the race. Now all Pearson had to do was finish, but in NASCAR, that's no easy task. First, Pearson got into a tussle with Leroy Yarborough. Pearson didn't need the win, but he wanted to put an exclamation point on his championship. Pearson got a scare as his engine began to misfire. One cylinder was dead, and he'd have to complete the race on 7 cylinders. The carnage continued. Crash after crash put Pearson's title hopes on hold. But David survived to finish second and come home NASCAR's 1969 champion. But the Pearson-Petty conflict didn't end there. The 500 came down to the last lap. They ran neck and neck, and then lightning struck. Petty's 43 stalled, and he had to watch in vain as Pearson limped home to a most memorable victory. The Intimidator, Dale Earnhardt, is the 6th winningest driver in NASCAR history. He's won 7 Winston Cup titles, and from the time he entered the NASCAR scene in 1979, Dale Earnhardt was a force to be reckoned with. NASCAR's Rookie of the Year in '79, his reputation for being a hard-nosed charger was born. Dale Earnhardt takes a backseat to no one. His battles with many a foe are legendary. In October of 1993, Earnhardt battled hard with Rusty Wallace as he cruised to a hard-fought victory. At Talladega in July of '93, number 3 had it out with Ernie Irvin in what was one of NASCAR's closest finishes ever. But there's another side to Dale Earnhardt, too. July 1993, the Pocono 500. Earnhardt took an opportunity on his victory lap to honor the recently deceased Davey Allison. Lately, Earnhardt has expressed caution about the new corporate status of NASCAR. Earnhardt hopes that the fans don't get left out in the cold should the new superstars become inaccessible, in effect turning their backs on those who made NASCAR the sport it is today.
Of course, no overview of NASCAR's epic rivalries would be complete without highlighting NASCAR's most important and long-standing rivalry, that of the manufacturers. The old cliche, win on Sunday, sell on Monday, has been and still is a driving force behind NASCAR's tremendous success. We'll be right back. Welcome back. A major component of NASCAR's continued success is its family image, and the racetrack's become a popular weekend destination for men, women, and children. Over the years, while countless families have filled the stands as spectators, others have made their way onto the track as racers. In fact, the storied history of NASCAR is filled with prominent families who've gone on to achieve racing greatness. We've mentioned the name Petty several times already in our program, and rightfully so. The Petty clan is the ultimate stock car racing family.
Lee Petty was one of the originals of Grand National Racing, now called Winston Cup. He won the first ever Daytona 500 in 1959, and that same year claimed an unprecedented 3rd Grand National Championship. He stopped racing in the early 60s, but the Petty name carried on with his son Richard, the most successful driver in NASCAR history. Richard Petty is the all-time leader with 200 victories, including a record 7 NASCAR Winston Cup championships and 7 Daytona 500 wins. He retired in 1992, the undisputed king of stock car racing. But he too has a son to carry on the family name. In 1986, Kyle Petty won his first Winston Cup race, becoming the first 3rd-generation driver to do so. He's since added 7 more victories to his credit and continues the Petty family tradition in NASCAR. In addition to Lee Petty, the early days of NASCAR also saw the emergence of the Flock brothers, Bob, Tim, and Fonty Flock. With roots in the high-speed tradition of moonshining, all 3 had success in the stock car series. Bob was NASCAR's first pole sitter and won 2 of the 8 races that first year. His brother Fonty went on to win 19 Grand National races in his career. But it was Tim who was the most successful, recording 40 career wins as well as 2 championships, first in 1951 and again in 1955. Buck Baker was a teammate of Tim Flock's and one of the fastest drivers in the 50s. He won the championship in 1956,
and the following year became the first driver to win back-to-back titles. He passed his knowledge of the sport along to his son, Buddy. Buddy became the first man to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier in 1970 and went on to record 19 victories of his own, including the 1980 Daytona 500. Ned Jarrett is another patriarch of a racing family. Ned won 2 championships, the first in 1961 and again in 1965. His son Glenn was a racer before moving to television as an announcer, and Ned himself had the thrill of announcing the action as his son Dale won the 1993 Daytona 500.
You know who I'm pulling for. It's Dale Jarrett. Bring her to the inside, Dale. Don't let him get down there. He's going to make it. Dale Jarrett's going to win the Daytona 500.
Dale Jarrett won the Daytona 500 again in 1996 and is one of the superstars of modern-day NASCAR in his number 88 Ford.
My dad won the Southern 500 in Darlington. We went home, and it looked like the entire town of Camden was there in our front yard, and that's what makes it special. And then 1993, winning the Daytona 500, my first time, and my dad calling it. I think those are 2 things that I can remember that really make this sport special because of the family aspect of it, and knowing that it's been the France family that has brought us to this point.
The Alabama gang of the 60s was founded by brothers Bobby and Donnie Allison, and the Allison family reflects both success and tragedy. Donnie was NASCAR's Rookie of the Year in 1967 and scored 10 wins through the late 70s. Bobby became one of NASCAR's greatest, placing 3rd all-time with 84 wins, including 3 Daytona 500s and the 1983 Winston Cup Championship. Sadly, Bobby had 2 sons who died tragically before their time. Clifford was an up-and-coming Busch Series racer who was killed in a 1992 crash in Michigan. Davey was the Winston Cup Rookie of the Year in 1987 and had already recorded 19 victories, including the 92 Daytona 500, before a helicopter crash took his life in 1993. These are but some of the families of NASCAR's past, the names and faces that helped shape racing as we know it today. And if 1997 proves anything, it may be that NASCAR's family ties show no signs of slowing down. To illustrate this point, one need look no further than a typical lineup of today's drivers. Consider John Andretti, nephew of racing legend and Daytona 500 winner Mario Andretti, and incidentally the godson of another legend, A.J. Foyt. Brett Bodine races with his brothers, Todd, and the 1986 Daytona 500 winner, Jeff. Jeff's son Barry also races in NASCAR's Craftsman Truck Series. Jeff Burton races with his brother, Ward Burton. 7-time Winston Cup champion Dale Earnhardt is the son of Ralph Earnhardt, a NASCAR short track legend from the 50s. Dale's son, Dale Jr., will run in NASCAR's Busch Series in 1998. Brothers Jeff Green and David Green race in Winston Cup, while their brother Mark compees in the Busch Series. 1984 and 96 champion Terry Labonte races with his brother Bobby, the Busch Series champion of 1991. 2-time Daytona 500 winner Sterling Marlin is the son of NASCAR journeyman Cuckoo Marlin. Kenny Wallace, Mike Wallace, and 1989 champion Rusty Wallace are all brothers racing at NASCAR's top levels, as are 3-time champion Darrell Waltrip and his brother Michael. We could go on and on along those lines for some time. There's the 1973 champion Benny Parsons, whose younger brother Phil races in the NASCAR Busch Series. We haven't even scratched the surface when it comes to family members who work as crew chiefs or team members preparing cars for competition. The role of the family has always been, and will likely continue to be, an integral part of the success of NASCAR. After all, NASCAR is a family-run organization. Bill France Sr. passing the torch to his sons, Bill Jr. and Jim, and now their children work in the organization too. Jim France, NASCAR's executive vice president, sums up the meaning of family to NASCAR's success.
You see so many families of Pettys and Bakers, and you know, you just go through the Woods brothers, or just about everybody, the Bodines, that they started out on a weekly track basis. The whole family was involved, and as they've gone on to the Winston Cup circuit, they continue to be involved. And I think that's just part of the fabric of the sport.
Welcome back. Racing is, of course, an inherently dangerous sport. Over the years, accidents on the track have claimed the lives of some of NASCAR's most popular and successful drivers, while leaving some others permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. NASCAR's made great strides toward improving driver safety over its history. Roll cages, fuel cells, and driver window nets are just some of the many innovations that have led to a sharp decrease in the number of driver injuries and fatalities. More and more, drivers walk away from accidents that once would have been thought unsurvivable. Here now are some of the more spectacular wrecks in NASCAR's 50-year history, and in each instance, despite the apparent severity of the crash, the driver lived. Both car and driver have certainly sustained some incredible punishment in the pursuit of speed. The safety record enjoyed by NASCAR, though, and the safety innovations developed in the sport that have been passed on for use in passenger cars are an important part of the sport's history. When we come back, a look at the other racing series NASCAR sanctions. Winston Cup isn't the only one that's growing. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Our focus thus far has been primarily on NASCAR's premier series, the Winston Cup Series, and its predecessor, the Grand National Division. But NASCAR also sanctions many other series. Although lesser known, these serve a number of purposes. For example, they provide a system for young drivers to gain experience and develop their skills, and also return racing to its original grassroots level. There, those who want to race but might not have the same level of financial support can.
Back in 1948, NASCAR proposed 3 divisions: strictly stock, modified stock, and roadster. What many today don't realize is that the strictly stock division failed to catch on at first due to a lack of automobile production during the Second World War. Apparently, not many were willing to pay to watch brand new stock cars bump and bang while they were themselves still driving a car from 1940. Therefore, it was the modifieds, older cars that could be altered for better performance, that drew the big crowds at first. It didn't take long for the Grand National Tour to take over as the premier division, but the other divisions showed that they too could provide competitive, exciting racing. In 1950, Alvin Hawkins initiated a new racing division, one which required only minimal expenses for those who just wanted to race. This became known as the Late Model Sportsman Division. In 1986, the Grand National title was transferred to the Sportsman ranks, which in turn became the NASCAR Busch Series we know today. In 1952, NASCAR launched the Speedway Division, which featured Indy-type cars, an experiment which was short-lived. There was even a convertible division, which emerged in 1955 when NASCAR merged with SAFE, a Midwestern racing organization. The most recent addition to the NASCAR family is the Craftsman Truck Series that debuted in 1995 with a 20-race schedule and a full television package. Today, there are a total of 12 different divisions of NASCAR, each with its individual specs and styles. Although they lack the fan base and financial support enjoyed by the NASCAR Winston Cup Series, they have their own unique appeal. Two-time defending NASCAR Busch Series champion Randy LaJoie has been a part of the NASCAR family for many years. Randy became exposed to NASCAR at an early age when his father raced modifieds up and down the East Coast. He too ran in the modified ranks before moving to the NASCAR North Division, where he won the championship in 1985. He's since become the man to beat in the NASCAR Busch Series, and while he's had offers to race on the Winston Cup level, he has no plans of leaving. Randy LaJoie joins us now to talk about all that. Randy, why? Why, when people seem to have such a fixation on the Winston Cup circuit, do you feel very contented in the Busch Series?
This is what I enjoy doing. I enjoy racing. I enjoy winning. And I've found that at this, where I'm at now, I mean, it's hard to get a good race team. It's hard to win races. And we're doing that. And I'm very happy. And my kids have a dad. I'm home, 2-3 days a week for my kids. And, I think my kids need a dad more than I need to be out driving around in circles on Sunday. I mean, hell, I get my fix on Saturday, and we're doing well. And I'm making a good living and visiting a lot of friends and get time out to do TV shows. So, I mean, life is good for myself right now.
When you were working your way up and cutting your teeth on those short tracks, did you feel a part of the whole big circus, if you will?
Well, we're under the umbrella. I mean, NASCAR has a huge umbrella, and when I won the North Championship in '85, I think the best part was the Gatorade sponsored a dinner for the champions, which we just did again the other night in Atlanta. But I mean, I was pretty much in awe. I mean, I just found a picture the other day and I put it up in my office because I mean, the modified guys, the Winston West guy, Darrell Waltrip, and Jack Ingram were there. Were all the champions from the NASCAR divisions. And it was really cool, and then I got one last year, and I got another one this year. So anytime you race NASCAR, you're under that umbrella, and it makes you feel like you're part of that family somewhere.
We're sitting here talking about 50 years of NASCAR as an organization. Are you surprised by where things stand, even in the amount of time that you've been involved in it? You surprised where things have gone?
Where it's gone, absolutely. I mean, '85 when I won that NASCAR North Championship and did the Gatorade thing, it wasn't a pimple, man. I mean, this is huge. This is big. I mean, NASCAR is I've been to Navajo. I don't know where the Hammers it was. It was out in New Mexico somewhere, and it was an hour away from anywhere.
Yeah.
And at a truck stop, at a Phoenix truck stop, and some of the car haulers were stopping there on the way to Phoenix, and 7,500 people turned out. And it was just incredible. And I was like, where are we going? I mean, it's cool because we're on a great wave. And we're going to ride it out because NASCAR's definitely done their homework. And they've got 50 years in it. And I hope they have another 50, and I hope I could be part of them.
Randy, thank you for joining us. Up next, when NASCAR's 50th anniversary continues, we'll go to the videotape for a look at the role television has played in growing the sport. Stay with us. Welcome back to How It All Began, 50 years of NASCAR here on Speedvision. Just as a generation ago it was thought impossible for a car to achieve speeds in excess of 200 miles per hour, so too is it unthinkable that invisible pictures beamed up into space could be bounced back to Earth almost in real time, bringing events the world over into people's homes live as they occur. The quest for speed is timeless, and just as man has strived to push his racing machines to their utmost limits, so have the means of capturing those images kept pace with the action. Almost from the very beginning, still photographers were on the scene, documenting races and land speed record attempts for newspapers and magazines. Into the 50s, motion picture cameras were the new standard, and by mid-decade, color film had pretty well supplanted black and white. Les Becker was an aspiring filmmaker when he shot this Daytona Beach film in February 1954.
We would have cameramen spread out, mostly on foot. Sometimes we'd have small stands, or sometimes we got a stand at the top of one of the very small wood grandstands that would not look very impressive at a high school these days. It was a much, much smaller business. It's hard to believe how much smaller stock car racing was back then. I think the growth of auto racing into a national event, a national sport, was directly attributable to the growth of television. As many sports can look back upon the small starts, and then television came along and made a national audience. A national audience meant national sponsors. National sponsors wanted to have some ID on their bodies or on what they were showing. And a car was nothing, at that point, to a sponsor. A car was nothing more than a very fast-moving billboard.
Boy, is that tire hot. You can see the mechanic on the tire just throw it to the ground. They're going to try to keep him back in this race. After all, there's still quite a bit of money at stake.
In about 65, when color became the standard for American television on all the networks, and ESPN came along somewhat thereafter, then America began to get enough auto racing.
Then president of ESPN, Roger Werner, was a key player in bringing the sport to a national cable audience.
Well, back in 1980, 81, when I first got involved at ESPN, there was really almost no motor racing of any kind on television. NASCAR, I think, only had at that time Daytona and Talladega. So we suspected that there might be an unexploited franchise in motorsports, particularly in stock car racing, and decided to take a flyer on some deals with a couple of the tracks other than Daytona and Talladega. And between 81 and 83, our hunch was confirmed. There was an underserved audience. There was a very responsive, loyal audience. And indeed, we saw the first signs of a real solid franchise that we created during that period of time.
Terry Lingner was a motorsports producer at ESPN in those early days.
One of the philosophies we had early on at ESPN was to go ahead and make sure that we weren't oversensitive to the potato farmer in Idaho. The networks for a long time had catered and thought that they had to instruct, or, pardon the expression, talk down to the viewer. And one of the philosophies we took upon ourselves early on was to talk to the head of the class. And I think people are smart enough, the viewers, we gave them credit for knowing a little bit about motorsports, and I think that was a real key factor in our success.
Since then, of course, it's gotten much, much more fancy. We now have cameras in cars transmitting video to the blimp, which comes back to the truck, which comes back to air. And it's really much more sophisticated than we ever thought it would have been.
The advent of the onboard camera and the onboard microphone that allowed viewers to ride along with the driver and literally eavesdrop on his conversations with the crew. That was, I think, also a significant factor in the growth of NASCAR's popularity on TV.
The marriage of media and motorsport has been hugely beneficial to both. And as each has grown from humble beginnings into solid financial and technological maturity, together they've flourished. Here's NASCAR's Executive Vice President, Jim France.
the cameras and the way they're able to capture the race is excellent now. In the early days, if you go back and look at early footage of telecast compared to what we have today, you can see the difference right away. And, so if I'm sitting at home watching the race on TV, I can get excited about it now. And it wasn't quite always that way. The show was always great at the track, but you didn't always get it at home.
In retrospect, I think that the increased television coverage that was provided by cable primarily in the 80s explains a lot about the current popularity of the sport. And though I'm not necessarily surprised that motorsports and NASCAR in particular has grown so popular over that period of time, I think that growth was linked to the increased exposure that people were given, particularly in NASCAR's case, exposure given outside the core southeastern markets. Today everybody knows who a Darrell Waltrip or a Bobby Labonte is, but some of the drivers that really built NASCAR back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I think are going to have their first television exposures on Speedvision. Many people who are close to the sport remember the great names like Lee Petty and Curtis Turner and Cale Yarborough and Fireball Roberts and all these guys. They were great drivers and great sportsmen, a lot of them. And I think now a new generation of NASCAR fans is going to have a chance to actually see them in action right here on television.
It was a fascinating period to live through. A couple of technological changes, many more than just going from film to video. It was different film equipment, different film stocks, then different video equipment. And every 2 years, it seems a new camera came out. We were talking about tube cameras, which is what we started with. Tube cameras gave way to chipped cameras, and who knows what's coming up next. But this revolution in technology is just about halfway there. I would say in terms of airlines, if you put a 747 at one end and the Wright brothers at the other, our industry is really in the DC-3 era.
Out of circulation for years, the race films of Les Becker and his contemporaries will be premiering right here on Speedvision all throughout this 50th anniversary year. When we return, we'll discuss the future of NASCAR, where it goes from here, and the issues it faces as we approach the new millennium. It promises to be interesting. Stick around. Welcome back. The 50th anniversary year of NASCAR is officially underway, and for the next 12 months, race fans will be able to gorge themselves on special events, ceremonies, TV specials, publications, and merchandise celebrating the illustrious history of the organization. The original ideal that stock car racing should provide wheel-to-wheel entertainment for the masses has never been lost or clouded by NASCAR management, nor forgotten by the participants. But its history also teaches us that NASCAR is always moving forward, always changing with the times. And amidst all the hoopla, some interesting developments promise to reshape Winston Cup racing in coming years. 1998 will bring further growth of the multi-car team, something that's been common in other forms of racing. But a tremendous difference is in Winston Cup, where the individual team cars have different sponsors. And this raises some interesting possibilities. For instance, what happens late in the season if one driver's leading a particular race but his teammates fighting for the championship? Could there be team orders to the leaders to let the title contender to go by? While this might make sense from a team perspective, how would the individual sponsor respond? Joining us now to discuss the ramifications of this and other developments is Corinne Economaki, publisher of National Speed Sport News. Appreciate your coming by. How do you see some of these issues playing out? We'll start with the multi-car team. How does that work in the future years?
Well, you talked about somebody getting orders to let their teammate go by. I think that's happened. But I also think what people have to understand about NASCAR is that the sponsors get what they pay for. They, if they have a good marketing program and PR program behind their involvement, they don't necessarily need to make it to victory lane. So it's a matter of what they do with their involvement and the publicity they get and how they market their product. I think they understand that that can happen.
Yeah.
One of the big stories of the mid to late 1990s has been a building boom of racetracks across the country.
Absolutely.
A lot of new facilities.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play out in the next 5 to 7 years?
Boy, people are wondering about ticket prices because of debt service, and people are wondering if they should buy the Penske Motorsports stock or Speedway Motorsports or International Speedway Corporation or Dover or Grand Prix of Long Beach. And I think Wall Street has a magnifying glass on these companies because two reasons. There's never been public companies in motorsports, so to speak, and they're relatively new. There's no history there. So they're watching very closely. The new track boom is just phenomenal. They're looking, NASCAR especially, is looking to get into the big markets. They're trying to expand to other parts of the country, and I think they're doing it. They're building in Kansas City. They're talking about Chicago. There was a new track open last year in California as well as Texas, so it's incredible growth.
How does NASCAR balance the growth with keeping the sport in touch with where it's come from? The growth, you know, I mean, there's no end to people waiting in line to buy tickets. No matter what the price goes to, the people are there. And realistically, I've been to an NFL game recently, and our ticket prices, ours being racing, still aren't at a par with what some of the other sports get. How do they balance that as the years go?
Well, that's a good question. I wonder myself how they're going to do that. I think they have not only an incredible fan base, which evolved from the Bible Belt, basically, but they're getting new fans because of their strong marketing program. I mean, NASCAR has just grown leaps and bounds marketing-wise over the past few years. I think you've seen that. We've all seen that. It used to be when you went to a racetrack, and if you saw somebody with a tied jacket on, you knew they were in this industry. Well, now you see them in the stands, you see T-shirts, they have coolers, they have leather jackets, cars, special edition. I mean, it's all over the place. Cafes, video games. You can't go anywhere without seeing something about NASCAR anymore.
And literally anywhere. Was in New York City recently, and there were NASCAR souvenirs in FAO Schwartz in the middle of Manhattan.
I wonder if the Manhattanites really know what it is, though. It's not a car town.
Yeah,
that's
that's probably true. Is there a risk of overexpansion? Is there too much of a good thing possible?
I would think there might be. I think that what's happening with these new speedways or corporations which are building or buying existing speedways is that because of the debt service, they're raising ticket prices. And the fan base, which has been in place for many, many years, is saying, you know, it's costing me another $200 to go to this event this weekend. And people with disposable income will only spend so much. But rumor has it that there are people waiting in the wings to take their place on the ticket lines.
We're visiting with Corinne Economaki, the publisher of National Speed Sport News. We'll come back in just a minute. Hope you'll stay with us. Welcome back to Speedvision's remembrance of NASCAR's first 50 years, how it all began. At that first meeting in Daytona 50 years ago, Bill France said in his address to those in attendance, and I quote, "We don't know how big stock car racing can be. I doubt if anybody here knows that, but I do know that if stock car racing is handled properly, it can go the same way big car racing has gone," end of quote. Chatting with Corinne Economaki, the publisher of National Speed Sport News. Corinne, it's certainly the sport of NASCAR racing exceeded even Bill France's wildest dreams.
Absolutely.
The question is, where does it go from here? And why do fans support the sport so much? Why have people fallen so in love with NASCAR racing?
I think there's two groups of fans, Alan. You know, the older fans who grew up with the moonshine runners, and the new fans who have discovered NASCAR through its powerful marketing. Part of it is they can say, that's the car that I have in my garage that I drive to work, or they think it's the car that they have in their garage. And part of it is that it's not a difficult sport to understand. Stock car racing is pretty simple, which is why a lot of women now are fans and watch it and go to the events. And some of these guys are pretty good looking, so women want to go and buy that Mark Martin T-shirt or whatever it is. And it's become more accepted by the general population. It used to be, it wasn't very accepted. It wasn't accepted by the media. It wasn't accepted by Madison Avenue. Well, now that the big corporations have gotten in and found out how popular it is and how much return they get for their sponsorship money, everybody wants to know what's going on out there on the track, especially in Winston Cup racing.
How much does the actual competition have to do with holding people? Okay, we've got this big marketing machine that gets people to try the sport. Is the competition what keeps them coming back?
From my point of view, yes, it would be. As you have, I'm sure, been to an awful lot of races, and there's been quite a few where I've been bored halfway through. But if you've got that door handle to door handle thing going on the track, or bumper to bumper, I mean, unlike other forms of racing where there's a lot of interval between the cars, that doesn't happen in stock car racing. There's almost no interval.
With so many other sports, the participants, the appeal of them as role models has diminished over the years. And that hasn't happened in NASCAR racing, and the organization has been very conscious of that. Has that contributed a lot to the boom and attracting fans?
I think it has to a degree. I think that the NASCAR Winston Cup drivers, almost to a man, are very, very charitable, and they donate a lot of their time. Obviously, they have commitments that they have to keep, but they also do nice things for people. They visit sick children. They donate their time to charities. They donate money to charities. And people are starting to hear about that a little bit, as opposed to a basketball player who spits on a fan. You know, who would you rather root for?
Corinne Economaki, publisher of National Speed Sport News, visiting with us on our 50th anniversary celebration of NASCAR. We'll come back with some final thoughts in a moment. Almost from its very inception, the NASCAR story has been one of tremendous success on all fronts. From its primitive, rough-and-tumble regional origins, it's evolved into a sophisticated national sporting and business phenomenon. Yet it's never lost sight of its basic purpose, giving fans wheel-to-wheel racing they can identify with. Perhaps most impressive of all is the fact that throughout NASCAR's history, the France family has never made any catastrophic management mistakes. By shrewdly guiding the organization through its growing pains, the Frances have withstood considerable internal and external conflicts, yet consistently emerged stronger and better positioned to compete as a sport, as a business, and as a family. As we approach the dawn of the 21st century, it seems there are no limits to what NASCAR can achieve, and where those next 50 years will take it, well, it promises to be a heck of a ride. I'm Alan Bestbrook. I'm so pleased you could join me for Speedvision's special presentation of NASCAR's 50th anniversary, how it all began. Thanks for watching. We'll see you at the races.